The light that found my son. My son was gone for 21 days. 21 days with no phone call, no voice, no sign that he was even still breathing under the same sky as me. I'm a man who built his whole life on being able to fix things. If something broke, I called a person and the person fixed it. If something was missing, I paid for it and it came back. That was my world for 44 years. Then my son was taken from a dirt road in a country far from home, and for the first time in my life, my money could not buy him back. My name is Yusuf Al-Fahad, and I am going to tell you what happened in those 21 days and what happened after, because I still cannot fully explain it, even now, even after everything. I can only tell you what I saw, what I felt, and what changed inside a family that once believed we needed nothing outside of what we already had. I was born in Jeddah, in a house that never once knew what it felt like to be short on anything. My father, Abdulrahman Al-Fahad, built his name slowly over many years in construction and in trade. By the time I was a boy, our family name opened doors. People stood up a little straighter when my father walked into a room. I did not understand as a child what that meant. I only understood that my father was respected, and that respect, in our world, was almost like its own kind of wealth, maybe even more valuable than the money itself. My mother, Amina, was a quiet woman, but do not mistake quiet for weak. She held the house together the way a strong wall holds up a roof, without asking for attention, without needing anyone to notice. She taught us the Quran before she taught us how to ride a bicycle. She woke before the sun every single day of her life to pray, and she never once, in all my years watching her, missed that early prayer, not for sickness, not for travel, not for grief. Our home smelled like her cooking and like the oud she burned in the evenings, and there was always the sound of recitation somewhere in the house. That was the world I grew up in, a world where faith was not a choice you made on Fridays. It was the air you breathed every day of the week. I had one brother, Faisal, 2 years behind me, and 2 younger sisters, Hind and Sarah. We were close the way children are close when they grow up inside the same walls, sharing the same rules, the same expectations, the same quiet pressure of a family name that people watched closely. By the time I reached my 40s, I was married to my wife Noura, and I was running one part of my father's business, the part that dealt with property and land. Faisal ran another part. We were not just wealthy. We were a family that believed wealth had a purpose, and that purpose was to serve God with it. My father built a foundation many years ago, and through that foundation, our family gave money to build mosques in different countries, gave scholarships to young men who wanted to study their faith deeply, and supported gatherings across Africa and Asia where our religion was taught and shared. This was not something we talked about with pride at dinner tables. It was simply what we did, quietly, because we believed God was watching how we used what He gave us. I say all this not to boast. I say it so you understand what kind of family we were, and how far we had to fall, and how far we had to travel inside our own hearts before everything changed. Noura and I had our son, Omar, after 4 years of trying and hopping and praying for a child. When he finally came, he became the center of everything, not just for us, but for the whole family. My mother would hold his small face in her hands when he was a baby and whisper prayers over him, over and over, like she was planting something inside him that she wanted to grow for the rest of his life. My father called him his little lion. Omar had this way of walking into a serious room full of grown men talking business and making every single person smile within a minute. He was clever and curious, and he asked questions that made adults stop and think. He was, in every way that mattered to us, the light of our family. When Omar finished school in Jeddah, we sent him to England for university. This was normal for families like ours. He went to Manchester to study business, and my father was proud because it meant Omar was preparing to one day take his place in the family business, the way I had, the way Faisal had. Noura and I flew with him ourselves. We found him a small flat near the campus. We filled his kitchen with food he liked. We met with his academic advisor and asked more questions than the poor man probably wanted to answer. Then we flew home, and we called him every single day. My mother called him every other day. My father sent him messages on Friday evenings after prayer, short messages, but always there. What we did not know, and what Omar never told us, was that university life was opening something inside him that we could not see from Jeddah. He made friends from all over the world. young men and women who talked about places and ideas that were nothing like what he grew up hearing. Two of his closest friends were a young man from Kenya named Brian and another from Sudan named Idris. The three of them were always together, always talking about places they wanted to see before real life, as they called it, closed in on them. Omar was the kind of young man who did not just dream quietly. He made plans. In his second year, he and his two friends began talking seriously about a trip to West Africa. They had been watching videos, reading stories online, and something about it pulled at them the way far places pull at young men who have never really been tested by the world. They settled on Mali. Idris said he had a distant cousin working there who could host them for a short time. The plan sounded simple, the way dangerous plans always sound simple to young people who have never had to face real danger before. Fly in, spend 10 days, come back before the new term started. Omar knew that if he told us the truth, we would say no immediately and probably fly to England ourselves to stop him. So he told us he was staying in Manchester for a quiet break with friends before the new semester. He said it in that easy, careless way that young people say things they have already rehearsed in their heads to sound unremarkable. And we believed him without even a small doubt, because Omar had never once given us a reason to doubt him. He flew out with his two friends on a Wednesday morning in September. For the first 2 days, we got small messages from him, nothing detailed, just enough to know he was alive and well. We had no idea he was not in England at all. We had no idea he was in Mali. The message that broke our world came on a Sunday night. It did not come from Omar. It came from Idris, who had somehow escaped and reached a safer town after everything happened. Brian's family reached us first, only a few hours after it happened, and then Idris called us directly, his voice shaking so badly we could barely understand him at first. What we pieced together was this. The three of them had traveled outside the capital toward a quieter, more remote area on the advice of a local man who said he could guide them somewhere beautiful and untouched. On that road, 2 vehicles stopped them, armed men. Aggressive, fast, clearly not their first time doing this. In the chaos, Idris managed to run into the trees and hide. Brian was beaten and left by the roadside. Omar was pulled into one of the vehicles and driven away, while his friends screamed his name into the dust behind them, and then there was nothing. Just silence and a road, and 2 frightened young men left standing in it. When that call ended, something inside me stopped working the way it used to work. I remember sitting down on the floor of my own office, not on a chair, on the floor, because my legs simply would not hold me anymore. Nura was already crying before I could even find the words to tell her clearly. Everything I had ever built, every deal I had ever closed, every deal that had made people call me a successful man, none of it meant anything in that moment. My son was somewhere I could not see, and I did not even know if he was still breathing. My father did what my father always did in a crisis. He picked up the phone. Within hours, he had called 3 different men he knew personally inside the Saudi government, men he had known for decades through business. He contacted our embassy contacts and demanded that something be done immediately. He hired one of the most well-known private security firms in the region, a company based in Dubai that had experience with hostage situations across Africa. Money, he told them, was not something to discuss. Send everything you have and send me the bill after. Within 3 days, we had a private team on the ground, working with local contacts to try to learn who had taken Omar and where he might have been moved. My brother Faisal flew out personally with 2 of our most trusted advisors to help coordinate things directly. Our embassy raised the matter through official channels. We were told, again and again, that this was a priority, that we would have full cooperation, that updates would come soon. What actually came was meeting after meeting that led nowhere, and information that dissolved into nothing the moment our people tried to follow it. We tried everything to reach whoever was holding him. Our security firm had people experienced in negotiating with armed groups across that whole region. They used every channel they had, backdoors, local contacts, men who knew how to move between governments and groups that lived outside the law. We made it clear, through every path available, that we would pay whatever was asked, that the amount did not matter, that we only wanted our son back safely. Nobody answered. Not a demand. Not a message. Not one single word from the people holding him, That silence was worse than any ransom demand could have been, because a demand at least gives you something to work toward. Silence gives you nothing but fear, and fear grows heavier every single day it is left alone. It was my mother who turned toward prayer with everything she had left in her. She had not stopped weeping since the news came, but she also had not stopped praying, not for a single hour that I could tell. She called the imam of the mosque our family had supported for years and asked for special prayers to be said for Omar. Through the connections our foundation had built over many years, prayers were said for him in mosques across several countries, by name, by people who had never met him, but who prayed anyway because our family had once helped build the place where they were kneeling. I remember thinking, somewhere in the middle of all that grief, that surely, with that many people asking God for the same thing, surely something would move. And still, day after day, nothing came back to us. It felt, my mother told me later, like every prayer rose up and hit something hard above us and fell back down to the ground unanswered. 3 weeks in, our security firm admitted, carefully, in the way people admit bad news slowly, that they had run out of strong leads. The embassy had produced meetings, but no results. My brother Faisal came home from the field looking like a man who had aged 10 years in 20 days. He sat across from my father in the family sitting room one evening and said quietly that we had done everything a man could possibly do, and it was still not enough. My father did not answer him. And for the first time in my whole life, I watched my father have nothing left to say. I remember one particular evening, sitting alone in Omar's bedroom in our home, just staring at the wall, when Nura came and found me there. She had been strong for weeks in a way that honestly amazed me, but that night I could see in her eyes that she was close to the edge of what she could hold. We sat together on the edge of his bed, surrounded by his old football trophies, his books, photographs of him as a small boy still pinned near the desk, and we did not speak. There was nothing left to say that we had not already said. We had money, we had connections, we had a family name that opened doors most people never even see, and none of it, not one piece of it, had brought our son home. It was in that quiet, heavy stillness that Mercy Wanjiru came to the door. Mercy had worked in our home for almost 6 years. She was from Kenya, in her late 30s, and she had come to Saudi Arabia through a proper agency, like many of the household staff our family employed over the years. But Mercy was different from the beginning. She was not simply an employee. She carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity that made you forget, sometimes, that she worked for us at all. She felt, in many small ways, like family. She knocked softly, the way she always did, and set a tray of tea down near the window. She looked at both of us for a moment, and there was something in her eyes that was more than sympathy. She had watched our whole family fall apart slowly over 3 weeks. She had seen my mother collapse in tears more than once. She had watched my father, a man who never showed weakness, grow quiet and grey. And what we did not know was that Mercy had been praying every single night, alone in her small room at the back of the house, for our son. She had said nothing about it because she understood, without needing to be told, the boundaries of a home like ours. But that evening, she told us later, something pushed inside her that she could not ignore anymore. A feeling, she said, like a small voice telling her it was time to speak, even if it cost her the job she needed. She stood near the door and said quietly that she hoped we would not be upset with her, but she wanted to say something. We looked at her. She said she had been praying every night since Omar was taken. She said she believed in a God who could reach into any situation, no matter how impossible it looked, and bring a person out safely. Then, carefully, respectfully, she asked if we would be willing to pray to Jesus for our son. I felt Nura go still beside me. I felt something rise up in me too, an old instinct, trained into me since childhood, that reacts whenever something outside of what I knew is placed in front of me. But I did not speak right away. Something about the calm in Mercy's voice, the complete absence of pressure in it, made both of us pause instead of pushing back. She did not wait for us to answer before she kept going gently. She told us about a man in an old story, a man locked away in prison, guarded closely, expected to die soon, and how people who cared about him prayed for him through the night, and how she said something came into that prison and led him out past every guard, through a gate that opened on its own. She told us about 2 other men, beaten and placed deep inside a prison in chains, who sang through the night anyway, and how the whole building shook, and every chain came loose. She said the God behind those old stories was not only a God from long ago. She said he was still alive and still moving the same way even now. I watched Nura's face while Mercy spoke. I watched it move through doubt and grief and something close to desperation before it settled into something I recognized because I was feeling it too. We were drowning, both of us quietly in our own home, and someone had reached out a hand. In that moment, the only question that mattered was not which religion the hand belonged to. The only question was whether we were tired enough, broken enough, honest enough to reach back. I spoke first. I told Mercy we would like to pray with her. Nura nodded beside me without saying anything, but her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Mercy asked, gently, if we wanted to bring the rest of the family into it. I told her, honestly, that I did not think they were ready for that yet, and that we should start quietly, just the three of us, in Omar's room. She carried a small, worn Bible in the pocket of her uniform, soft at the edges from years of being held and read. She opened it and read a passage out loud in English, then explained it slowly to us in Arabic. She read words about someone who called himself the Life, someone who said that whoever believed in him would never truly be lost. Then she read something from a book of songs and prayers about God being close to people whose hearts were broken. She read slowly, giving each line room to breathe, and I felt something loosen in my chest, like a knot pulled too tight for weeks, finally beginning to ease, just slightly. Then Mercy bowed her head and prayed, and it was unlike anything I had heard in over 40 years of my own faith. She did not recite something memorized. She spoke plainly, directly, the way a person speaks to someone standing right in front of them. She reminded God, as she put it, of what he had done before. She said he was the same one who opened locked doors long ago, and she was asking him to do it again, now, for a young man named Omar, tied up somewhere far from home. Nura was crying quietly before Mercy had even finished 3 sentences, and I was not far behind her. The 2 weeks that followed were some of the strangest weeks of my entire life. On the outside, nothing had changed. Omar was still missing. Our security firm still had nothing solid. The diplomatic channels were still producing meetings and no answers. My father was still on the phone constantly. My mother was still reciting her prayers. Faisal was still working every contact he had in the region. But something had shifted quietly inside Nura and me that we could not explain to anyone else around us. There was a strange stillness in the house that had not been there before. A fragile, quiet sense that something was moving, even if we could not see it yet. Every morning, before the rest of the house was fully awake, Nura and I would find Mercy in a quiet corner of the home, and she would pray with us again, simply, directly. We did not tell the rest of the family what we were doing. That was a deliberate choice. I knew my father well enough to know that even the suggestion of praying to Jesus in our home would be met with immediate, firm rejection. My mother, as gentle as she was, would have been deeply hurt by the idea that her own faith was not enough for this moment. Faisal, even more traditional than my father in his practice, would have seen it as a betrayal, especially given everything our family name stood for across the world. The grief in the house was too raw, and the timing was too delicate for that kind of conversation. So we carried it quietly, meeting Mercy each morning, praying in low voices, holding on to something we could not name, but also could not let go of. It was on a Thursday morning, exactly 14 days after that first prayer in Omar's room, that my phone rang with a number I did not know. The country code did not belong to Saudi Arabia. My hands were shaking before I even picked it up. A man on the other end spoke Arabic with an accent I did not recognize and told me he was calling from a police station in a town I had never heard of. He said they had a young man in their care, found wandering alone 2 days earlier, confused, without a phone, without any papers, without money. But the young man had been repeating a Saudi phone number over and over, asking anyone who would listen to please call it for him. The officer said the young man claimed his name was Omar Al-Fahad. I could not speak for what felt like a long time. The officer asked gently if I was still there, and I told him yes, though my voice did not sound like my own. I called my father the moment the call ended. I called Faisal right after. Within the hour, our whole family network was moving again, but this time with a completely different energy. This was no longer desperate searching. This was retrieval. My father's contacts moved fast. A private plane was arranged within hours, and Faisal was on a flight before the day was even over. Our security team on the ground coordinated directly with the local police to keep Omar safe and comfortable until everything could be arranged. Nura and I stayed behind in Jeddah, unable to eat, unable to sit still, just walking through our own home over and over, holding onto each other, waiting for something that had felt completely impossible only 2 weeks earlier. Omar landed in Jeddah on a Saturday evening. The whole family was at the airport. My parents, Faisal and his wife, Hind and Sarah, all of us standing together in the arrivals hall with our hearts beating so loudly it felt like everyone around us must have been able to hear it too. When Omar finally walked through those doors, thin, pale, clearly shaken, but alive, walking on his own legs, my mother went down to her knees right there on the airport floor, weeping in a way I had never seen from her before. My father, a man I had never once seen cry in my whole life, stood with tears running freely down his face, his hands raised. I held my son for a long time and did not say a single word, because there was nothing in any language big enough for that moment. We brought him home that night, and the house filled quickly with people. Relatives, friends, business contacts, people from the mosque who had prayed for him, all of them coming to see with their own eyes that he was really home. There was food and tears and laughter, the particular kind of noise a house makes when relief finally arrives after weeks of holding its breath. My mother would not let Omar out of her sight the whole evening. My father sat beside him for hours, one hand always resting on his shoulder, not saying much, just staying close, as if making sure he was really there. We let that evening run its full course before the family finally gathered late that night in the sitting room to hear what had actually happened to him. Omar spoke slowly, carefully, the way people speak when their mind is still trying to make sense of something. He told us about the road, the two vehicles, the men, the vehicle he was pushed into with his eyes covered so he could not tell where they were taking him. He described a small compound, low concrete buildings, dry open land with nothing around it he could recognize. He was kept in a room with a dirt floor, a small window too high to reach, and a door that locked only from the outside. His captors brought food occasionally, water occasionally, and rarely spoke to him, and when they did, it was in a dialect he barely understood. He said the hardest part was not the room or the hunger or the heat. The hardest part was the silence, not knowing if anyone even knew where he was, not knowing if anyone was coming. He lost track of the days somewhere after the first week. He prayed, he told us, in the way he had been taught his whole life, asking again and again for mercy, for rescue. He said he prayed with more honesty and more desperation than he had ever prayed before in his comfortable life back home. But then, quietly, with his eyes down, he told us that the prayers had felt, to him, like they were going nowhere, like shouting into an empty room. He was not saying it to hurt anyone in that room. He said it because it was the truth of what he lived, and he felt we deserved the truth from him. The room went very quiet when he said that. My mother's hands tightened in her lap, but she did not interrupt him. My father stared at the floor. Faisal sat with his arms crossed, listening. Then Omar told us about the night everything changed. He said he had been there almost 3 weeks by his own count, when he woke suddenly in the middle of the night without knowing why. The room was lit by something he could not explain, a light that was not coming from outside, because the window was too small and too high, and there was no electricity in that place, not at that hour, not ever, as far as he had seen. He sat up and saw a figure standing near the locked door. A man dressed in white, with light around him that was warm instead of harsh, the kind of light that should have hurt his eyes, but somehow did not. Omar told us he was not afraid, and that this was the strangest part of the whole night, because every instinct in his body should have told him to be terrified. Instead, he felt a calm settle over him that he still cannot fully describe. In that stillness, he became aware, without needing to be told out loud, that this man was the one called Jesus, and that he had heard the prayers of the people who loved Omar, and that it was time for him to go home. Omar looked down and saw that the ropes around his wrists were already loose on the floor beside him, though he had no memory of them being removed. The door opened on its own, and Omar was led, quietly, past the sleeping guards, out into the open night, without a single person stirring. He said he walked for what felt like a long time, following that same presence, until lights and buildings slowly began to appear ahead of him. When he turned to ask where they were, there was no one there anymore. He was simply standing alone on a street as the town around him began to wake up. The sitting room was completely silent after Omar finished. No one reached for their tea. No one shifted in their seat. My mother had tears sliding down her face. My father wore an expression I had never seen on him before, not grief, not pride, something more open than that, something searching. Hind and Sarah were holding each other's hands tightly. Faisal looked at Omar for a long moment, then looked down at the floor. It was Noura who spoke first. She reached over and took my hand and looked at me, and I knew exactly what she was thinking, because I was thinking it too. We had prayed to Jesus with mercy 14 days before Omar was found. We had asked, quietly, for our son to be brought home safely. And now our son was sitting in front of us, telling us that a man in white had come into a locked room in the middle of nowhere and led him out into the light. There was nothing left to argue about, nothing left to explain away with logic. Something had answered us, and our lives were not going to look the same again. What happened in the weeks after that was not one big dramatic moment. It was slow and quiet, and it moved through our family the way morning light moves across a room, a little at a time, until every corner is lit. Noura and I gave our lives to this faith first. With Mercy gently guiding us, weeping with joy as she walked us through what it meant to really believe. We sat together in Omar's room again, the same room where all of this had started, and we prayed and said out loud what we now believed to be true. Omar followed within the same week, telling us that the moment that presence had spoken to him in that room, something in him had already changed, and he knew he could never go back to what he believed before. Then came Hind, then Sarah, quietly, privately, each of them coming to Noura and me separately within the same month to say they believed too. Then my mother, Amina, the most devoted among all of us, came to me one morning with her eyes red from a whole night of crying, and told me she had been reading a Bible that Mercy had quietly left in her room, and that she could no longer deny what she had read there. And finally, my father, Abdulrahman, the man who had spent his life funding faith across continents, called me into his study one evening and said, simply and quietly, that the God who had saved his grandson was the only God he wanted to serve for whatever years he had left. The decision to leave Saudi Arabia was not made quickly, and it was not made in fear. It was made with a full understanding of what staying would cost us. As believers in this new faith, we had no legal protection there, no space to worship openly, and no future that did not mean either hiding what we believed for the rest of our lives or facing consequences none of us wanted to imagine. We moved slowly and carefully over several months. My father, Faisal, and I worked quietly with our advisors to begin stepping back from the businesses and shares we held. It was not simple. Our family's interests were tied deeply into the local economy, and untangling ourselves required patience and care, so we would not draw attention before we were ready to leave. We chose the United Arab Emirates, specifically Abu Dhabi, close enough to still feel familiar, but open enough that we could finally breathe. There were real churches there, with people from every corner of the world sitting together. The idea of walking into a building to worship without fear was something none of us had ever known, and something all of us needed badly. We arrived as a full family. My parents, Faisal and his wife, Hind, Sarah, Noura, Omar and me. And Mercy Wanjiru came with us too, not as someone who worked for us anymore, but as the woman God had used to reach our whole family, someone who had become as close to us as anyone who shares our blood. I want to speak plainly to whoever has read this far. I was a man who had everything the world says makes a person successful: money, influence, a family name that opened doors most people never even knock on, and a faith I practiced with real sincerity for over 40 years. And when the moment came that mattered more than any other moment in my life, when my son was tied up somewhere far from home, and every resource I had was used up, and every prayer I knew how to pray had already been prayed, and the silence above us felt endless, it was Jesus who answered. Not because we earned it, not because we did something correctly, but because of who he says he is. He opens locked doors. He walks into the darkest rooms and leads people back out into the light. If you are carrying something too heavy right now, if you have already prayed every prayer you know, and the silence around you feels like too much, I want you to know something simple. He hears you, He answered a family that barely knew him at all. He can answer you too.